All right. I can go over there on that monitor. We'll just give it another minute or so for people to finish logging in. I think someone's just having a little trouble logging in. Hold on a second while I do the text. All right, I think that is about right and about time to go ahead and get things underway. So good afternoon and evening to everyone, depending upon where the sun is in your sky. We are picking up again in our Pathway to Judaism class for the year 5781, and it is time to go into some service information. We've talked about prayer in more general terms, and we've talked about the Amidah, one of the core sections of daily prayer. But there is a section of the service that takes up a large portion of each Saturday or holiday service, which is perhaps not quite a service as people are expecting, especially if you are unfamiliar with traditional Jewish worship activities. The idea of having a large text reading in the center of what is otherwise full of prayer and blessing may seem a little weird. So we are going to take apart the Torah service as we have it. It has evolved over the centuries of Siddur, of the prayer book's development. We're going to look at the pieces that we have here in the Ashkenazic tradition and try and understand what they are saying, why they are included, and how it tells us to relate to not only the service, but also to God and the Torah itself. Really, the Torah service and its full architecture is beautifully constructed to help teach many of the core messages and values of Judaism. But sometimes it is not really appreciated as the fine crafted artwork that it is. So we'll take a little time. I will also go over some of the melodies so that if you are looking to this as a reference for practice, you'll have that to go back to. So without any further ado, let's get it underway. So the Torah service, in fact, has many different structures, many different subcategories, pieces that lead us through it. It begins with a fanfare. It moves on to a very special removal of the Torah. It then, of course, has the textual readings. Then there are additional blessings that are included at this time. And it is all concluded with a return of the Torah to the Ark, the Aron HaKodesh. We're going to go through each one of these pieces as they each in order to see the details of each. But I just want you to appreciate the structure, that it is not, we don't just run up, take out the Torah, flop it on the table and begin reading. That the reading is situated within a full orchestrated, choreographed ceremony in order to heighten our understanding, our experience, to move us through a spiritual relationship, connection to everything that is going on. We could have done it faster. We could have done it simpler. Our ancestors have decided, and we continue to honor their decision by recognizing its benefit, that having this system, this arc through the Torah service has many, many benefits. Let's look at each piece and how they fit together. So we start off with our fanfare. And the fanfare really comes with two parts. The second part is always included. The first part is not always. And as you'll see throughout the Torah service, and indeed throughout many of our other prayers in the Siddur, in the prayer book, many of the passages and lines are taken from the Tanakh, from the Bible itself. Some of them have been slightly reworked to fit the context, but most of them are verbatim quotes at this section of the service. And we begin with the phrase from Psalm 86, "There is none like you among all the gods, my Lord. There is nothing like your deeds. Your kingdom is a kingdom of all eternity. Your rule is for all generations. Adonai reigns, Adonai reigned, Adonai will reign forever. Adonai gives strength to his people. Adonai will bless his people with peace." Now, what an interesting collection of passages to have at the beginning of a Torah service. Now, obviously, and you'll see when we do the music for this, it is intended to glorify God, to make it as though this was a pageant for the pronouncement of some mighty declaration by an earthly king. But you'll notice a major difference. This king is not talking about how great he is. This king is instead sharing a document which is designed to make our lives good. We say throughout Judaism that you know a good king by the good laws that his people enjoy. You don't know a king by the size of the army. You don't know a king by the size of the kingdom. You know a king by the law. And indeed, that is what these passages have been collected to remind us. You might have thought that as the kingdom of Israel had been destroyed, the nation of Judah, and then first by the Babylonians and then by the Romans, that since we lacked national sovereignty on a piece of land, that God's kingdom, well, wasn't always that impressive, or indeed God's reign wasn't all that impressive. By putting these passages here as part of the Torah service, we are saying that God's true kingdom is the kingdom of Torah. God's true kingdom is the kingdom of law, of mitzvot, of the commandments, of guiding us in our human endeavor to live a good and proper life full of spiritual depth and meaning. That is where God continues to reign. That is the ultimate kingdom. And indeed, in that, nothing else can compare. And from that, we achieve peace and we achieve strength. So despite all conventional evidence to the contrary, when we come into the Torah service, we have a sense of pride, a sense of strength, a sense of purpose, and a sense of continuing growth towards a better and better life. And it begins with these passages. And as I mentioned, it shouldn't therefore be surprising that the passages are sung most commonly to a very, what's the right word, regal type of melody. Ein kamocha v'Elohim Adonai v'ein kemasecha malchutecha malchut kol olamim umemshaltecha bechol dor v'ador Adonai melech Adonai malach, Adonai imloch, le'olam vahed, Adonai hoz, le'amo yiten, Adonai yivarech, et amo v'shalom. So those are the 4 lines that we had just discussed. Oh, where's my cursor? There we are. And that finish here. And as you can tell, they were written with a very powerful, very strong melody. And I'm just noticing that in my review that I forgot to include the translation for the bottom 3 lines. So I'll do those translations extemporaneously. But first, I'm going to sing it so that you can hear that there is a very important topical shift through the melody. So we're picking up here on the 5th line. Av harachamim hetiva v'etzoncha et Zion tivne chomot Yerushalayim tivne chomot Yerushalayim, Kivecha levad batachnu, melech eram venisa, Adon Olami. So those last three lines, you may have noticed, the melody shifts from the bum pum 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 to a da dee da 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 dee to almost of a lullaby type melody. And this is a very deliberate choice of the composers over our ages to try and show that as the first part glorifies God as Melech, Adonai Melech, Adonai Malach, Adonai Yimloch, and Malchutecha, Malchut, it's very, very strong references to God as king. The second half turns to God as our parent, as our father. And that is why it moves to a more loving melody as opposed to a powerful melody, reminding us that God is not only a powerful lawgiver, but that God is a loving parent who is giving instruction. And that is really the twin theme with which we approach the reading of the Torah to guide ourselves. And of course, that we know that God wants what is good for Zion, for the people of Israel, and that God will rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, a symbol of our independence and our ability to live as Jews free from persecution or oppression, and that we turn to God and God alone, and it is only in God that we truly place our faith, and that God is indeed a great and mighty, lofty, I guess is a better word, great and lofty God that is the master of the world. Now you know why I write out the translations in advance. It makes them much more fluent. After that section, however, we then open up the Aron HaKodesh, we open up the Ark itself, and there, of course, is where the Torah sits, and we say the following passages. When the Ark would travel, Moses would say, "Rise, Adonai, and let your foes be scattered. Let those who hate you rout before you." From Zion, for from Zion the Torah comes forth, the word of Adonai from Jerusalem. Blessed is the one who gave Torah to his people, Israel, through his holiness. Now, these first two passages seem a bit out of place. The first is talking about the Ark, but the Ark that it is talking about is the Ark of the Covenant, made famous in the Torah and slightly less famous thanks to the movie of Indiana Jones. This was the large golden box in which many of the treasures of our people, namely the Ten Commandments and other signs of God's care for us, were kept. But that ark is gone. And indeed, we no longer have those items. They were taken and destroyed by our enemies. Additionally, to say the Torah comes out of Jerusalem, well, for most of the last 2,000 years when these would be sung, we weren't in Jerusalem. At least the vast majority of Jews were not allowed or able to live in Israel or Jerusalem. There was always still a remnant there, but the vast majority lived out of the land. So it seems almost again that we are talking about the Torah, or we're talking about this moment in a way that doesn't quite match reality. Until you recognize that what this is saying poetically is that indeed what God truly gave, that would set our foes, make our foes afraid, and that would make them move from us. The thing that truly is coming out from Jerusalem is Torah, and that is something that is carried and travels with us no matter where we are. We have gone out of Jerusalem, not just in the sense of our instruction, but physically for most of the last 2,000 years. We were outside of that city, and that God was with us during that. The ark may no longer travel, but we do. And that means the Torah itself, the instruction of God, continues to travel and move wherever we go. And that by keeping to the Torah through this poetic parallelism, that is how we will be able to eventually overcome our enemies. Not by fighting, not by magic, not by some other superstition, but we will eventually overcome them by maintaining our connection, our passion for God as exemplified through our study and practice of the commandments as found in the Torah. And that is why the final line, which is the first line we've had so far, which is uniquely authored, says, blessed is the one who gave Torah to his people through his holiness, because we have basically gone through all of these lines and said, only because of the gift of Torah can we sing all of these lines in gladness and joy and with strength, rather than with regret of what we have lost. For what we continue to possess, the Torah, is greater than any particular set of borders, is greater than any particular golden items, greater than even the Temple of Jerusalem. It is ultimately the Torah that is the greatest blessing God has given us. And that is something that we still have a hold of. So that's quite an introduction, and it's quite a fanfare. But again, sometimes it's easy to miss some of this. I always consider it quite ironic that the parts that people know how to sing best are the parts that people often understand the least. When somebody is forced to read the English in the Siddur because they don't know the Hebrew, they will come to understand it and be familiar with it and consider the words. But if they can sing the Hebrew, if they know the melodies, they often will stop thinking about what the words mean. Ironically, that's even more so ironically, even if people understand Hebrew, oftentimes it'll still just become a song. And as you'll see when we sing this next section, it is a very good song. The melodies are beautiful and very powerful, but we need to make sure that it doesn't become only a song. Vayehi binsoa ha'aron, vayomer Moshe, Kuma Adonai, ve'afutzu oivecha, ve'anusu mesanecha mipanecha, ki mitzion tetzei Torah, Ki mitzion tetzei Torah, udevar Adonai mirushalayim, Baruch shenatan Torah Torah, Baruch shenatan Torah Torah, Le'amo Yisrael b'kedushato. And that concludes the formal beginning of the Torah service, the fanfare section, if you will. We then begin our transition to the removal of the Torah from the Aron HaKodesh, from the Ark. And this is usually prefaced in our community by a reading, a meditation, if you will, called Berich Shemay. This is a prayer, a petition that was written in Aramaic, found in the Zohar. Some debate over exactly whether it was originally a marginal note or included in the original text, but it has become a beloved part of our reflections as we are taking the Torah out. It is meant to use the modern lingo, make us more mindful of what we are about to do, rather than just reaching for the Torah again, even after the fanfare, and not fully seizing what the moment means. It begins with a petition. Blessed is the name of the Master of the world. Blessed is your crown in your place. May your desire be with your nation, Israel, forever. May you show the redemption of your right to your nation in your holy temple. May you fill us with the best of your enlightenment, and may you receive our prayers with mercy. May it be pleasing before you to lengthen our lives with good, and I, your servant, shall be remembered together with the righteous ones. Have mercy on me and protect me and all that I have, and all that belongs to your nation, Israel. You are the one who nourishes all and provides all with their livelihood. You are the one who controls everything. You have control over kings, and their kingdoms are yours. So this is a fairly standard collection of different types of petitions and reflections. But by doing so before the Torah, we are making ourselves mindful that ultimately what we are seeking through these petitions is found through a path that runs through the Torah. But we remind ourselves of some theology in the next paragraph. I am the servant of the Holy One, blessed be he, as I prostrate myself before him and before the glory of his Torah at each and every moment. I put not my trust in any man, and I have no faith in the sons of the gods, a euphemistic term, either being used as a derision of other faiths that believe that God had children, or as a statement that was sometimes used to mean the high and mighty, that is to say, the powerful within the secular world. Instead, my trust and faith are only in the God in heaven, who is the true God. His Torah is true, his prophets are true, and he abundantly performs compassion and truth. In him I trust, and I say, praises to his holy and precious name. The final paragraph, which is usually sung out loud, even if the first two are often not, is where we get to our focus with regards to the Torah at this moment. May it be pleasing before you that you shall open my heart with your Torah, and that you may give me male sons, that is the more traditional form, who shall fulfill your desire. Again, this is not just about a preference for one gender over another, but traditionally men had more commandments that were their responsibility, something we discussed in our class on women in Judaism, and something which is no longer applicable. But this is saying that there would be more that would be able to fulfill more of the Torah. And may you fulfill the requests of my heart and the heart of your entire nation Israel for good, for life, and for peace. Amen. That last phrase, that you fulfill my requests for good, for life, and for peace, is reminding us that the Torah is there to guide us and to temper our own desires, to make sure that only our desires are only for good, for life, and for peace. And that is one of the main blessings the Torah gives us, is helping us to understand what it is we should truly value in the first place. The version that we continue to sing goes as follows. Behanarachetz velishme kadisha kadisha yakira hanahema tushbechan behanarachetz behanarachetz velishme kadisha kadisha yakira Anahema tushbechan Yehera avakadamach Detiftach libi beoraita Vetashlim mish'alim delibi Veliba decholamach Yisrael Letavul chaim velishlam Amen. Now, as I mentioned, this is written in Aramaic, although the letters, of course, are the same alphabet as used in Hebrew. It's a sister language to Hebrew. And it was written in Aramaic because that was the language of the Zohar. Now, there are many different customs around this passage. Like I said, some don't recite it at all. Some do it as we do it before the Torah is removed. Some recite it after the Torah has been taken out of the ark, but before any more sections of the service have been done. Some only recite it on Shabbat, since the original is in a passage about Shabbat, and that is our custom. And some omit the phrase, the sons of gods, as this could imply that there are such things. We do not, as we know from many other passages of the prophets and throughout the rest of Tanakh, that we often make reference to the gods of other nations. That doesn't mean we believe they exist. It means that we understand that others believe they exist, but we also know that they are not true. The Torah is then taken out of the ark. It is handed to the carrier, somebody who will hold the Torah for the next portion of the service. We then are led in the Shema, the Echad, followed by Gadlu. We then march around the sanctuary, going to the right. It is customary for most Jewish activities to begin with the right, simply as the right hand was an idiomatic expression of strength from the ancient world. Now, those sections, the Shema, the Echad, and the Gadlu, those translate to be, Hear Israel, Adonai is our God, Adonai is one. One is our God, great is our Lord, holy is his name. Magnify Adonai with me and exalt his name together. Now, those first two lines are said in a call and response, meaning the leader will read the first one, and then the congregation repeats. The reader leads the second one, and then the congregation repeats. Because this is one of the fundamental truths of our faith, and we want to make sure that even those who may be unable to have learned these passages by heart yet, or to read them from the Siddur, can still participate with them. But importantly, what we are saying while holding the Torah in our declaration of only one God is that we are saying that there is one God and there is one Torah. There is God and there is one instruction for our people. We make no claims about the instructions given to others around the world, but for us as Jews, the Torah is it. It is not an old versus new. It is simply singular, as God is singular. We don't really believe God changes his mind for the instructions of how we should live. This is also reminding us that the Torah that we are about to read comes from this God, this God who has been our God, the same God of Abraham, the same God of Moses, the same God of David, the same God for us. This is the same God when we approach the Torah that they approached. And so we indeed have a same connection as they had. And so it is only appropriate that we then turn and bow for that final line to magnify Adonai and to exalt his name. The first two passages are sung to the now traditional melody for the Shema. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. And then the congregation repeats. And then the next line, Echad Eloheinu, Gadol Adonenu, Kadosh Shemo. And the congregation repeats. Those on the bima then turn to the ark, to the Aron HaKodesh, and bow as the last line is sung. Gadlu l'Adonai iti, uneromema shemo yachdav. Oops, hold on a second. Can I go back? I want to go back. Nope, go back. But hold on. There we go. This then begins the processional. Now, for the last year or so, we have been not engaging in the processional because of the threat of COVID-19. I am confident that hopefully soon we will be able to resume this portion of our service, at least with some safeguards in place. The Torah, as I mentioned, is carried around the congregation, around the sanctuary, as a way to represent the Torah being among the people. The Torah is not a private priestly book. It is not something that is only read by the scholars. It is something that belongs to each and every one of us. It has been customary, again, not during COVID, for people to reach out with the tzitzit, the fringes of their talit, to touch the Torah and to kiss them as a sign of connectedness and love to the commandments that are contained within and symbolized by the fringes, the tzitzit. If a person is not wearing a talit, it is customary for them to use the edge of their siddur, their prayer book, in the same manner. Like I said, at the moment, we haven't been doing that because of COVID, but someday soon, hopefully we'll be able to resume that. Just keep your eyes open for further announcements on those different protocols. The Torah is then brought back up. It is placed upon the Aron HaKodesh, upon the shulchan, the table, and then we begin reading. And we'll go over exactly how to have an aliyah, the way that a person is called to the Torah to be able to do the blessing. We'll do that in another class. But this is the part, unfortunately, where people get lost. And I don't mean they get lost with the reading, that they can't follow along. Following along is not hard. Within our handout as well from our Gabayim, those are the people who are assisting on the bima. We know what page we're on. We know what chapter we're in. We know what verse we're on. All of that's easy. But what does it mean? Well, like I said, this is where people get lost. This is not meant to be a Torah reading. This is meant to be a Torah study, an understanding. Because there are some problems as we try to make sense of what's going on, right? We have to ask ourselves, how is it that there could be a document that was written in a language that we humans could understand perfectly? How could that perfectly contain God's understanding of the universe? Right? How do you even begin to imagine that there is such a thing as a language that can contain the infinite wisdom of God? If we can speak it, it cannot contain all of God's wisdom. It's simply mathematically impossible. We are finite. Our languages are finite in their expression and form. God and God's wisdom is infinite. The infinite cannot be compressed into the finite. Well, yes, that is true. However, among those attempts to compress God into the finite, the Torah does perfectly convey the clearest statement of God's will possible in a human language. We do not claim that the Torah contains all of God, for that would be literally impossible, but we do believe that God wants us to understand a particular slice of God's wisdom, what we would call God's will, what we would call God's commands, what we would call God's instruction, remembering that the word Torah means instruction. And that the Torah we have, that language, that is the clearest version that God could give us that will enable us to get the most from it. However, on the other hand, it doesn't speak for itself, right? That understanding of what God wants us to get from it is not self-evident. You can't just read the book and you'll understand it. We talked about this in our earlier classes about the different texts and layers of Judaism's history with text, that no book reads itself and no reader is exactly the same as another reader. And no reader is perfectly equipped to be able to get everything out of it by him or herself. It is way too easy for a reader to make mistakes when trying to grasp the full meaning of the Torah, which is why it should not then be surprising that we do this reading publicly and that Judaism is committed not only to these formal reminders of Torah, but to continuing to give both lectures and classes in unpacking the meaning of the Torah. Right? We have to continue to study by ourselves, but most importantly with others, to be able to hear the ideas bounced back and forth. And as those ideas continue to be shared and continued to be studied together, we sharpen our own understanding and we get closer and closer, as a human can, to the understanding God wants us to have for ourselves and for our lives. That's not easy. But it does mean that while reading the Torah, it cannot be a passive experience. If you are in the congregation, you can't just sit there and listen. You have to be paying attention. And while paying attention, it doesn't mean memorization. It means consideration, considering the words, considering the meaning. There's a reason why all of our copies have commentary on the bottom of the page. It is to remind us that the words do not speak enough for themselves without our attempt to unpack them. It'd be like being given a wonderful birthday present all wrapped up in a lovely paper and bow and never taking the time to open it up. The reading is that wonderful package and bow. The understanding is when you take the time to peel back the paper and see what's inside. And this is just meant to give us that base understanding, a base reminder, so that we can continue to go into more and more depth. Now, in addition to the Torah itself, reminding again that is the first 5 books of the Tanakh, from the book of Genesis through Deuteronomy. In addition to that formal reading, which we read from each week and take up, and so that we can read the entirety of the 5 books throughout one year, we also read a bonus section called the Haftarah. Now, the word Haftarah, which means conclusion, bears no connection to the word Torah, which means instruction. As you can see from the Hebrew, there is no shared root going on there. Unfortunately, a lot of people say Haftorah and Torah, and people think that it's somehow related. It's not. There is no connection between the words. It is, however, connected to the word maftir, which is the concluder, as that aliyah, that final section of the Torah reading, was added to ensure that the reader of the Haftarah would also show the Torah that some respect. That's why whoever has the final Torah reading is also the reader for the Haftarah. Now, with the two blessings before the Torah then, from the Maftir, and one before and four after the Haftarah, that means there are 7 total blessings associated with the Haftarah. 7, of course, throughout Judaism being a symbol of perfection. And the main theme of the blessings is the dependability of God's word as transmitted through the prophets. And particular emphasis is placed on the promise of ultimate liberation. Now, the Haftarah is given as a bonus reflection that will mirror the theme of either the Torah reading for the day or of a part of the calendar that we are in. So if it is on a holiday, it'll be the theme of the holiday. If it is on a time preceding a holiday, it'll often be a reminder that the holiday is coming. For example, we are now coming into the period of time where we are receiving the Haftarot of admonition, the Haftarot of criticism that remind us of all of the mistakes we made that led up to Tisha B'Av, which was the subject of our previous class. So there are 3 weeks where we receive special readings in the Haftarah taken from the prophets that are reminding us of our ancestral errors. Those have no connection to the Torah readings, but instead are mapped to the calendar. And then after Tisha B'Av, we get 7 weeks of special readings that remind us that God has not abandoned us or rejected us, and that despite the catastrophes of Tisha B'Av, that God is still with us and supports us. So we get those 7 weeks of consolation to comfort and provide a reassurance that despite those tragedies, there is still a bright future. Now, following these readings, we then get to the section of the Torah service that contains additional blessings. Usually these are prefaced by the blessing Yakum Purkan. Now, Yakum Purkan is relatively new. It's only about 1,000 years, we think. Well, at least the version that we have. We see it from around 1100s, but we know there were probably earlier Babylonian versions. We know the different passages that we have found through archaeology and through digging through old archives contained many specific references to the leaders of the Babylonian community, meaning both the religious and secular leaders. And this is why we have a moment in our service where we give a blessing for our community, for our leaders, but we also include blessings for our country, meaning the United States of America. And if you were living in England, there is a blessing for England. If you live in Italy, there is a blessing for Italy, for the country that you are in, no matter where you are. And now there is also a custom to do a blessing for the state of Israel. Other blessings are also welcome. You'll find that we often do a blessing for peace. We'll do a blessing for health. We'll do a blessing for creation. We want to make sure that we use this time when the Torah is out and it is there as a symbol to guide us, to make sure that we are reflecting on the deepest desires and needs that we, our community, and our world have, so that we recognize that it's the Torah that leads us to the solution, that leads us to the fulfillment of these petitions. Now, why was Yakum Purkan written in Aramaic, like the Barich Shemeh, right, what we did earlier on? Well, there's a folk reason that's recorded, which is that it was in Aramaic because apparently the angels didn't understand Aramaic. So when we read this prayer, the angels wouldn't get jealous of our praises of God. Now, the Tosafot, great scholars from the Middle Ages, they said, cute, but no, that's not the reason. Instead, it was written specifically in Aramaic because Aramaic was known by a wider audience. Even though Hebrew is now thankfully known by many more people than Aramaic, for most of our history over the last 2,000 years, many Jews knew Aramaic as the language that was common in most of the Near East, even if they didn't know Hebrew all that well. So this section of the service, along with other things like the Kaddish or parts of the Talmud, were written in Aramaic to make them more accessible. It was about making them available to more people to understand what they were saying and why they were saying it. And indeed, that's one reason why we do many of these sections in English, because we want to make sure that it is understood. There was nothing magical about Aramaic. It was simply chosen as a way to reach more people. And for our congregation, English will reach the widest audience for these passages. I mentioned that there is a prayer that we do for the state of Israel. The prayer that we use begins Avinu Shebashamayim, which is our Father that is in heaven. Yes, that is a Hebrew phrase that was borrowed by another religion, but we still get to use it too. Now, this was written in 1948 at the dawn of Israel as a country by Rabbi Herzog, and then edited by the great literary master of Israel, Shai Agnon. And the phrase that is most prominent in it, the first blossoming of our redemption, this has powerfully captured our belief that the state of Israel is the prologue to the redemption, but that the work is not done. That we see the restoration of Israel as an independent state in 1948 as being a prelude to a final phase of worldwide global redemption and peace. But obviously, we're not done yet. Certainly, it is unfortunately conceivable that it could fail to fully materialize. But I personally have faith that we will get there and that we are in that channel. But how quickly we are able to bring peace to ourselves and others, well, that is something very much open for debate and discussion. I don't expect it to happen overnight. I don't even necessarily believe that it might happen in my own lifetime. I don't try to speed up the plan more than simply by doing what I can personally. The Chief Rabbi of England, Emmanuel Jacobitz, has added the phrase, "May it be the first blossoming of our redemption," just to make it a prayer rather than a statement of belief. For some, this is more in keeping with their own theology. Personally, I like the way that Rabbi Herzog phrased it, and so we don't include Rabbi Jacobitz's amendment, but it is found in our prayer book, and I would like you to understand why it is there in the brackets. Now, when we go to the Rishalmi to try and understand this, to understand the phrasing, we can see a story taken from the lives of the rabbis. There was an incident regarding Rabbi Chia the Great and Rabbi Shimon ben Chalafta, who were walking in the Arbel Valley at dawn, and they saw the burst of the first light. Rabbi Chia the Great said to Rabbi Shimon ben Chalafta, "My rabbi, such is the redemption of Israel. A bit, as long as it continues, it increases." So when we talk about this reshit, this beginning, this blossoming, that is the metaphor we are going for. That it is just that shining spark of light that will continue to grow and grow and grow. And as long as it's growing, we're doing okay. And that is our blessing, that is our prayer, and that is our responsibility. We then turn to the return of the Torah, having had the fanfare, having had the preliminary blessings when taking it out, having read from the Torah itself, as well as the Haftarah, having added additional prayers and petition of significance and really superlative need, we now recognize that the Torah must go back. And we do so, taken again from the Psalms. Let them praise the name of Adonai, for his name alone is exalted. His glory is above earth and heaven. He has lifted up a horn for his people. Now, the phrase of lifting up a horn, a keren, this is a metaphor from biblical poetry that refers to the promise of ultimate salvation. And it's figuratively to immediate salvation possible through Torah. The idea was that the way a bull might throw back their head and the horn would rise up, that's the symbology of the ancient vision. And a praise for all his devout, for the children of Israel, a people close to him. As you can see, very fitting choice of all the Psalms for our conclusion. We have just drawn as close as we can to God through our reading and study of Torah and through our understanding of what its role is in changing our life and changing the world. This is as good as it gets. This is the high point. And so we sing, Yahallelu et Shem Adonai, ki niskav Shemo levado, Hodo al eretz v'shamayim, Vayarem keren le'amo. Tehila lechol chasidav livnei Yisrael am kerovo. Hallelujah, hallelujah. And then the Torah begins the march for the return procession, which begins on the left-hand side in the reverse of the way we brought it out. Throughout it, on a regular Shabbat, on Shabbat rather, as opposed to weekdays, we will sing Psalm 29. You're welcome to look into this psalm in more detail, but Psalm 29 emphasizes the phrase over and over, Kol Adonai, the voice, the sound of God. This is obviously linked to the revelation at Sinai, where we all heard the voice of God in the revelation of the Ten Commandments. Psalm 29 also links us to the idea that the voice of God is echoed in the Torah and the world around us, that it is not silent these days, that it is still going on, echoing throughout creation and throughout the gift of Torah. And the psalm also reminds us of the ultimate goal of the Torah in this world, which is to bring peace. And then when the Torah is brought to its rest, when we put it in the ark, we say, and when it rested, he would say, return Adonai to the myriad of Israel. Now, I don't know how good your memory is, but Numbers 10:36, we're going to flip back all the way up, mostly to the beginning. Boom. You'll notice Numbers 10:35. That's right. These verses are bookends. We took one verse where the ark would travel, and we took the other verse when it would come to a rest, and in between it, we squeezed the whole Torah. And the idea is that while we have been reading, it is as though the ark was up, the ark was moving, not only scattering our foes, but what happened was when we would travel, as we've been reading about a lot in Bamidbar, the book of Numbers that we are in this part of the year, it guided us, it showed us the way to go. And indeed, that is the role the Torah fulfills for us in our service. So by putting these two verses, which are next to each other in the Torah, on either side of the Torah service, the architects of the service are making a very powerful statement of the role that Torah has for guiding us in our life. And now I need to find where I left off. Just a second. Oh, keep going, come on. Oh, and there. And then the Radak, the commentator, points out, advance or rise, O Lord, to your resting place, you and your mighty ark. Your priests are clothed in triumph. Your loyal ones sing for joy. For the sake of your servant David, do not reject your anointed one. This was said by Solomon on the dedication of the temple. So this phrase of both arising and returning to a resting place found an echo within the Solomonic time period with the dedication of the temple. And so it is also fitting as an echo of that moment for our own expression within our own synagogue, our own sanctuary, Temple Israel. Now, it's customary for us only to do the first few words, Uvnucho Yomar, and then we continue with the next few phrases, as I just translated, privately. This is sort of a last moment of private reflection, of allowing ourselves to feel that connection to God, and to hold on to what we have learned, what we have grasped, and the questions that may still remain, so that they can continue to be something that we will investigate and live by in the days that come after that Torah reading. And then, as Malbim says from the book of Kings, God chose to rest his presence on the house which was chosen through the merit of David. And after he chose Zion and established his presence there, he once again exerted his providence to maintain the house of David in the merit of the temple. As it says, arise, O Lord, to your resting place for the sake of David, your servant, that last section that we usually read privately. This teaches that David's merit caused the divine presence to dwell in the temple. So there are layers upon layers upon layers of meaning and things to reflect upon during these moments as we are preparing for the ark to close and to shift from this part of our service. And we do that final shift, the final prelude to the closing of the ark, the conclusion of the service, with a section taken first from the book of Proverbs, 3 passages, although not in order, and then from a passage from Eicha of the book of Lamentations. For I have given you a good teaching, do not forsake my Torah. It is a tree of life for those who hold it, and its supporters are praiseworthy or happy, depending upon your translation. Both really are the same. Its ways are ways of pleasantness, and all its paths are peace. Bring us back to you, Adonai, and we shall return. Renew our days as of old. This is the final idea of hold on to the Torah, even though we are putting it away, still keep a grip on it, keep a grip on what has been taught, because what it has taught makes your life good and pleasant and peace. And that is ultimately what brings us closer and closer to God. And so the final few passages are sung as follows. Ki lekach tov natati lachem, Torati al ta'azovu. Eitz chayim hi lamachazikim ba, v'tomcheha mehusha deracheha darchei noam. V'chol netivoteha shalom. Hashivenu Adonai elecha benashuva. Chadesh, Chadesh Yameinu, Chadesh Yameinu kekedem. At that point, the ark is closed and we are seated as we begin to, in our service, go to a more fuller discussion of some aspect of Judaism, what you might call the sermon. And then following that, on a Shabbat morning, we will have the Musaf service, which is a special service for Shabbat itself. That will conclude our formal part this evening. Does anyone have any questions before we finish for tonight? All right. Neither seeing nor hearing any. And a reminder, throughout the class, you're always welcome to put questions into chat or to raise your hands formally through Zoom. Judaism likes questions. I hope you're getting that idea. But if you don't have any other questions for today, or if you have questions that you want to talk about with me privately, feel free to
I have a question.
Or connect me. Or we can have one more question. Yes.
Hagba and Galila.
Yes, Hagba and Galila.
Where
so I cover the
honors.
Right, those are honors that I cover more in the section about having an aliyah. But just for completeness, when we finish the formal reading of the Torah, we lift the Torah up over our head and we face the text towards the congregation. This is sort of an early version of, look, honest, it's right here. We weren't making it up. You can look for yourself. These are the words. But it is also a very powerful moment for people to realize that there is nothing hidden in the Torah. God didn't plant anything secret. God made everything revealed and clear. It's connecting us to it. And it is indeed a great honor to be the person to lift, that is Hagba, or to do Glila, which is the wrapping, putting the belt around the Torah and the covering of it so that it can be put away with respect and honor. So those are two very important honors. Hagba in particular, the lifting takes a little bit of practice and technique. It's not as easy as it looks, but it's also not as hard as it looks. So if you're interested in learning how to do that, let me know. All right.
Thank you, Rabbi. Welcome back.
Thank you. Good to be back and good to see you, or at least see the names of the others here. And I know there are other people on